Greetings, friends of liberty. Often I confess myself astonished when I survey contemporary British society and see the enormous progress in all manner of art, science and industry unfolding daily before our very eyes. I certainly expect England to do her best, but that this should be her best, well, even for me it is at times almost overwhelming, the list of our achievements. Shall we mark some of our more extraordinary in the last 2 centuries? Number 1, in medicine. We have John Willis, the path-breaking brain anatomist, revealing the structure of the brain in drawings of minute accuracy. We have Dr. James Lind, the Scotsman who discovered a cure for that dread plight of the seaman, scurvy. And last but certainly not least, Edward Jenner, with his almost miraculous vaccine for smallpox. Number 2, in natural philosophy, we have the unrivaled talent of Isaac Newton, also displayed in his mathematical genius. We have the superlative productivity of that recluse, Henry Cavendish, who discovered the gas hydrogen and that it was very flammable. And of Robert Hooke, the polymath, the first to publish a finding of how plant cells looked under a microscope. Number 3, in astronomy, Edmund Halley of Halley's Comet. William Herschel, who with his sister Caroline discovered the planet Uranus. And John Flamsteed, who assembled an extremely accurate star catalogue, numbering over 3,000. Number 4, in philosophy, who could rival the stupendous brilliance of Locke, Hume and Bentham? Number 5, finally in industry, we have Newcomen, Watt, Savory, Wilkinson, Murdoch, Arkwright and Smeaton. We might as well stop here because the list is well nigh infinite. However, despite my astonishment at viewing the multiplicity of luminaries which shine so brightly in the firmament of English science, philosophy and industry, what is yet more astonishing is the natural feeling of humanity, of feeling for their fellow man, of true fraternité that characterize the English soul. The British people are foremost in all the world in acting to free the slaves, and to stop the slave trade. So, of course, 'twas no surprise that Justice Mansfield, in his famous decision of 1772, outlawed the keeping of slaves in England. Now, abolishing slavery would, of course, be a monumental worldwide achievement. But since someone should make a start of it, who better should it be than we British? Secondly, apart from our abolitionist movement throughout England, in the entire 18th century, we've seen an enormous growth of charitable and philanthropic institutions of all kinds, a growth well nigh unparalleled and unrivaled by any other country. This, too, speaks well of British character. 2 of the more prominent examples of this benevolence are the Foundling Hospital for abandoned infants, started in 1739, which now has numerous branches throughout London, and the founding of the Magdalen Hospital in 1758. Thirdly, in inculcating this fellow feeling, we have the enormous increase in the reading of novels by the British public. No, you shouldn't scoff, since by reading a novel you can develop a feeling of sympathy, a fellow feeling with the characters, understanding their point of view, personal situation and circumstance. And so I hardly need mention the most famous of English novels of this century in part or whole. Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, Gulliver's Travels, by that delightful misanthrope, Jonathan Swift. Pamela were virtually rewarded by Samuel Richardson, and Tom Jones by Henry Fielding. Again, I could go on and on. Clarissa, Joseph Andrews, and the female Quixote. I think, however, by now you see my point, that not only is England surpassing all other nations in science and industry, but also in enriching the very soul of the nation, in cultivating a feeling of compassion and sympathy for their fellow man. Now, if we turn from such instances of sympathy and fellow feeling in my own time to those found in your own more contemporary 20th and 21st century in the West, and even throughout the entire civilized world we see today, we find the deeply researched and well-constructed argument of Canadian psychologist Paul Bloom in Against Empathy, the Case for Rational Compassion. In this, Bloom deconstructs some of the many myths modern society holds surrounding empathy and gives us a glimpse into the advantages and disadvantages of using this complex psychological trait to understand ourselves and others. Bloom begins, appropriately enough, by mentioning the horrific school shooting in December 2012 in Newtown, Connecticut, where Adam Lanza first killed his mother, then went to the Sandy Hook Elementary School, killing 14 students and 6 teachers. This atrocity affected our author profoundly, partly because A, of its extreme violence, B, because he also had children, and C, he lived nearby, and it affected the lives of many of his neighbors. And so, as he says, our response to that event at the time and later on was powerfully influenced by our empathy, by our capacity, many would see it as a gift, to see the world through others' eyes, to feel what they feel. But here, in his contrarian way, he already concludes, after listing its virtues, that on the whole, empathy is a poor moral guide. In order to justify this claim, he begins to assemble his complicated argument against empathy. However, first we should distinguish emotional from cognitive empathy, which is the act of understanding other people, getting inside their heads and figuring out what they are thinking. He's not really against this, although here too he says this sort of empathy is overrated as a force for good. Instead, he's more focused on emotional empathy, when we feel the feelings of another person is feeling. Here he says, the act of feeling what you think others are feeling is different from being compassionate, from being kind, and most of all, from being good. From a moral standpoint, we're better off without it. That's his thesis, boldly stated. Bloom continues, describing how empathy in the Adam Smith sense, the emotional empathy sense, can occur automatically, even involuntarily. So John Updike writes, my grandmother would have choking fits at the kitchen table, and my own throat would feel narrow in sympathy. And since nowadays many believe that emotional empathy is a good thing, we get a plethora of books, book titles such as The Age of Empathy, Why Empathy Matters, The Social Neuroscience of Empathy, The Empathy Gap, Empathy in the Global World, and How Companies Prosper When They Create Widespread Empathy. And for some psychologists like Simon Baron Cohen, evil individuals are nothing more than people who lack empathy. So, as Bloom then says, how can we put empathy to the test? One way is to look at its consequences. If empathy makes the world a better place, then its defenders are vindicated. But if it turns out that the exercise of empathy makes the world worse, then woe to them. So let's turn to what he believes are some of the consequences of feeling empathy. Number 1, he believes that empathy is a spotlight shining on one person's or one group's plight, but that spotlights have a narrow focus and only illuminate what they're pointed at. So empathy reflects our biases. So, for example, he argues that while parents are understandably concerned about potential school shootings, The deaths from all these annually equal about 0.1% of American homicides, a statistical non-event. In other words, more school children were murdered annually in one American city, Chicago, and yet I've never thought about those murdered Chicago children. He appears thus to be arguing that the empathy caused the concern and response to be disproportionate, with, for example, so many toys arriving in the mail for the children of Newtown that a vast warehouse was crammed with plush toys that the townspeople had no use for. His conclusion then is that we should also empathize with the children and families in Chicago, and while we're at it, with billions of other people around the world in Bangladesh and Pyongyang and the Sudan. For this reason, he says that the capacity for emotional empathy defended by so many scholars, theologians, educators, and politicians is actually morally corrosive. One study, for example, found that if the case of a terminally ill girl is described to subjects, and if they're encouraged to feel empathy for her, they're more likely to want to move her ahead in the line for getting favorable hospice treatment than those people who were encouraged to be more objective about her situation and not feel empathy for her. Number 2. So he's given us now one reason for his dislike: selectivity and bias. What other reasons does he give? He says, despite what many psychologists claim, that there's no real relationship between empathy and kindness. Kind people, he says, are not necessarily more empathic. As an example, he describes the following scenario. I see a child crying because she's afraid of a barking dog. I might rush over to pick her up and calm her, and I might really care for her, but there's no empathy there. I don't feel her fear, not in the slightest. So, he argues, being empathic does not make you more kind, with hundreds of studies being done showing only marginal or no effect of increased empathy on kindness and good behavior. Number 3. He says that another point to realize when people say that empathy can motivate good behavior is that any feeling can motivate good behavior. Not just empathy, but also anger, fear, desire for revenge, and religious fervor. All of these can be used for good causes. Similarly, regarding the effect of art, he adds, many, including myself, have argued that novels like Uncle Tom's Cabin and Dickens's Bleak House prompted significant social change by guiding readers to feel the suffering of fictional characters. But we tend to forget that other novels push us in different ways. For every Uncle Tom's Cabin, there is a birth of a nation. For every Bleak House, there is an Atlas Shrugged. We can see here, incidentally, what he thinks of rugged individualism, egoism, and Ayn Rand. Number 4. People who feel lots of empathy, who rate a 6 out of 6 on their EQ, empathy quotient, are often called empaths. Some empaths, such as a psychologist that Bloom mentions, can be happy and successful being helpful, kind, and understanding of others. But others are distinctly unhappy, they being overly nurturant, intrusive, and self-sacrificing. Similarly, Bloom cites studies of doctors which often show that doctors with more compassion but less empathy, like the successful empaths, do a better job. Why is that? Because as one doctor said, if while listening to the grieving mother's raw and unbearable description of her son's body in the morgue, I were to imagine my own son in his place, I would be incapacitated. This is true, and one reason why doctors who can't achieve this emotional distance often experience burnout. Research on empathy shows, among others, the following results. A. Who is more likely to feel empathy for the hardcore, hyper-feminist Andrea Dworkin, who said men especially love murder? In art they celebrate it, in life they commit it. A hardcore feminist or your average man? This is what experiments repeatedly show. People feel less empathy than those who don't have their values. So someone who got AIDS by having unprotected sex or injecting intravenous heroin generally gets less empathy than someone who got AIDS by a blood transfusion accidentally. ethical values filter or modify the empathic urge and response. B, it is often said that people who lack empathy are psychopaths, and those are the worst people in the world, so you need empathy. Research here has found that psychopaths actually dial up the emotional empathy when they need it and dial it down when they're raping or killing you. Secondly, psychopaths also in part appear to rely more on cognitive empathy and less on emotional empathy. But psychopaths too have less emotional intensity with all their feelings. So whether lack of empathy by itself plays a role in their ability to do harm and violence is not clear. C, when it comes to the research on empathy in babies, the results are varied. Bloom argues that while babies show concern for other babies and get upset if they hear recordings of other babies crying, this is just an expression of concern for the other baby and not a feeling of empathy too. But then it's also true that older toddlers sometimes respond to the pain of others by getting upset and then soothing themselves. This really does suggest that they are in some sort of empathic distress. Number 5, turning to politics. If we try to understand whether it's liberals or conservatives who feel and express more empathy, the results generally show that liberals tend to show more empathy across the board, with women showing more empathy than men and thus voting consistently about 5 to 10% more for Democrats. However, it is also true that liberals and conservatives tend to show empathy towards different types of people and policies. So, for example, on gun control, liberals often argue for gun control by focusing on the victims of gun violence, but conservatives point to those who have their guns taken away from them, now defenseless against the savagery of others. Each side then distributes its empathy in accordance with its political values. Bloom ends his discussion by mentioning how A, important the use of reason is in incorporating and expressing compassion and concern. B, how so many research findings which seem to prove that empathy is important or human beings irrational cannot be replicated, this failure of replication now becoming widespread. C, how even when you can confirm that a study is statistically significant, that doesn't mean it has any real-world relevance. And D, how, while it's true people somewhat irrationally tend to follow the party line and vote for their team politically, whether Democrat or Republican, in contrast, in their personal affairs, where there are direct and immediate personal consequences to their decisions, people show a much higher degree of rationality. Let's turn now to evaluating this book, navigating our way through the psychological and ethical intricacies Bloom presents. I'd give it an A because he does a great job presenting the viewpoints of many different sides, giving the reader a comprehensive exposure to perspectives on and aspects of empathy. In addition, he has a brilliant and often devilish sense of humor. First is to his own approach. Here we have to distinguish between his concentrated attack on the popular notion of empathy as held by many liberals and many psychologists, and on the other hand, his attack on empathy as it should be understood as it really is. So on the one hand, I think he's utterly correct in pointing out how often people like the psychologist Baron Cohen and many others assume that empathy is equivalent to morality and nothing really is needed or is important. This is clearly false. And so this gets us, secondly, to an issue that complicates the whole discussion, and that's the distinction between emotional empathy and cognitive empathy, simply understanding another person's character, motivations, and values. This, in my view, is enormously valuable, doesn't create much emotional stress, and probably is a place from which emotional empathy can naturally flow if needed. Empathy, in reality, is just a tool. It's like a hammer. Who would ever write a book entitled Against Hammers? So if you use a hammer to pound in nails, it's used correctly. If you use it to hit yourself on the thumb over and over again, it's being used incorrectly. Both cognitive and emotional empathy, like a hammer, are just tools. Why would you be against tools? So when Bloom says, as we heard in the beginning, that on the whole, empathy is a poor moral guide, that misunderstands the nature of a tool. Likewise, when he complains that some literature motivates good behavior and others bad, that's hardly an argument against literature per se and the empathy it creates. Just bad literature. In my own experience, given that I had good parents, but they didn't teach me at all about empathy, it took me quite a while to learn how to use both cognitive and emotional empathy. And when I did, it was enormously valuable and significantly changed my life and my ability to relate to others. It's not clear, at least, why getting an appropriate and increased cognitive understanding of another person or persons should be bad. It's just a type of applied knowledge. And throughout the book, Bloom hardly specifies whether he's criticizing cognitive or emotional empathy, so you hardly know what he's referring to. And when it comes to emotional empathy, it's not clear why experienced users of emotional empathy can't adjust for the effects that he describes and we know will occur. So no one will expect that a doctor should allow himself to get burned out by feeling constant emotional empathy. That's using the tool incorrectly. But if you see someone who's been raped, you might at times, with some people, allow yourself to graphically imagine what they went through as a way of connecting yourself emotionally with them. It can be a way of reminding us what the experience entails. And partly because when another person knows you understand them, whether cognitively or emotionally, that in itself can be enormously valuable to them and for us when they understand us. Further criticisms of Bloom's approach are the following. A. He clearly thinks Ayn Rand and ethical egoism are bad. Imagine comparing Atlas Shrugged to Birth of a Nation. Unfortunately, he doesn't understand that the moral purpose of your life should be your happiness. But that doesn't imply others can't be of great value to you or that you shouldn't risk your life for them if your happiness or honor depends on it. Perhaps it's not surprising that he appears to be against meat eating on ethical grounds and for the movement called effective altruism, whose most effective practitioner was the fraudster Sam Bankman-Fried. B. He rightly describes how, when American GIs discovered the Nazi concentration camps, they quite understandably tortured the SS men they found there. This again indicates human beings have no sympathy or empathy for those who don't share our ethical values. So if we see the sufferings of an individual, it's still in the end our ethical values and not the feeling of emotional empathy itself that conditions our response and whether it's practical to help the person more. C. He complains that empathy is innumerate, favoring the one over the many. What he's ignoring is that you can help only one person, often only one person, especially a person you know well, better than many strangers. That's one reason why people feel more capable of relieving the starvation of one child in Africa instead of the whole continent. In addition, starvation in other countries often involves factors like bad governments that we can't control anyway. This is why if we help people in our own neighborhood or those close to us, we usually know more about them and the situation and thus, if it's practical at all, to start helping them. Happy for my part that, whether out of empathy or compassion, my England is leading the way in the movement to abolish slavery, one of the most dreadful and inhumane institutions known to man. I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.